Of the 12,000 species cataloged in the Galactic Biological Archive, not one had ever made Dr. Rinnie pause mid-scan. She had sequenced the DNA of hive-minded insects, silicon-based reef dwellers, and gas-breathing giants who lived inside storms. None of them had surprised her. Humans were supposed to be even less interesting than all of those. The sample had arrived that morning in a sealed cryotube from Earth's embassy, delivered as part of a routine genetic registration that every new Confederacy member completed. Rinnie had placed it in the sequencer without ceremony. Humans were a young species, barely 2 years into first contact, and everything about them screamed ordinary. Average height, average lifespan, carbon-based, oxygen-breathing, no natural armor, no venom, no telepathy. The kind of species the Confederacy welcomed politely and then forgot about. Her assistant, Davin, had not even looked up from his own work when the sequencer began its run. He was young for an Irani, still chasing his research certification, and human genetics held no glamour for him. The first pass completed in under a minute. Rinnie opened the results on her display and began scrolling through the standard markers. Chromosome count, base pair, density, mutation rate, mitochondrial lineage. All within expected parameters for a class 3 primate species. She was about to stamp the file as complete and archive it when the sequencer flagged an anomaly. A large section of the genome, far larger than normal, had been marked as non-coding. Junk DNA, in common terms. Every species carried some. Rinnie almost dismissed it. But the flag was not yellow, which meant unusual. It was red, which meant the sequencer could not classify what it had found. She leaned closer. The non-coding region stretched across multiple chromosomes, threaded through the genome like veins through stone. It was not scattered randomly the way junk DNA normally appeared. It had structure, repeating patterns, nested loops, regulatory gates stacked on top of each other in layers so dense the sequencer had needed 3 attempts just to map them. Rinnie ran a comparison against the archive's master database. The system held genetic records for every sapient species discovered in the last 40,000 years. If these sequences resembled anything from any known world, the database would find the match. The search took 11 seconds. It returned 0 results. She ran it again, widening the parameters to include partial matches, fragments, even distant evolutionary echoes. 0 results. Again, she lowered the threshold to 5% similarity, which was so loose it would normally return thousands of false positives from microbial genomes alone. 0. Davin finally noticed her silence. He walked over, saw the results on her screen, and frowned. He asked if the sequencer was malfunctioning. Rinnie shook her head. She had calibrated it that morning. She pulled up the structural map of the dormant region and expanded it across her full display. What filled the screen looked less like biology and more like architecture. The regulatory sequences guarding the dormant genes were not simple locks. They were layered, conditional, interconnected. Opening one gate would depend on signals from another, which depended on signals from a third. It was the most sophisticated genetic regulation Rinnie had ever seen, and she had been doing this work for over 30 years. Davin asked what species could evolve something like that naturally. Rinnie did not answer him, because she was beginning to suspect that nothing could. Natural evolution was messy, redundant, full of dead ends and leftover code from millions of years of trial and error. What she was looking at was clean, precise, every base pair placed with intention. She saved the file under a restricted access tag and locked it to her personal credentials. Then she sat back in her chair and stared at the screen for a long time. Humans had been in the Confederacy for 2 years. They attended diplomatic functions, traded basic goods, asked polite questions about galactic history. Their ambassador smiled too much and laughed at jokes that were not particularly funny. They seemed eager to please, the way all young species did when they first realized how small they were compared to the galaxy around them. And buried inside every single cell of their bodies was something that did not belong to any known branch of evolution in the recorded history of the galaxy. Rinnie picked up her communicator and placed a call to Dr. Fassad, a computational biologist stationed 3 sectors away. Fassad was Marini, brilliant and paranoid in equal measure, and he owed her a favor from a joint paper they had published 6 years ago. She told him she needed him on Pallor 9 within the week. When he asked why, she told him she had found something in a routine sample that should not exist. He asked which species. She told him that. He went quiet for a moment, then asked if she was certain. She said she had run the comparison 4 times. He said he would leave in the morning. After the call ended, Rinei turned back to the display. The structural map of the dormant human genome glowed softly in the dim light of her lab. She reached out and expanded one small section, a cluster of locked genes buried deep inside chromosome 7. Even this tiny fragment was more complex than the entire regulatory genome of most Confederacy species. She thought about the human ambassador and his easy smile. She thought about the species reports she had read, how humans were described as adaptable but fragile, clever but short-lived, emotional but cooperative, a harmless species on a minor world. She looked at the locked fire hidden inside their DNA and wondered if the galaxy had made a terrible mistake in not paying closer attention. Fossat arrived on Pallor 9 4 days later, carrying nothing but a single datapad and the expression of someone who had not slept during the journey. He was tall for a Merenni, with a silver-gray skin and wide-set eyes common to his species, and he walked into Rinei's lab without greeting anyone. He simply pointed at her main display and said, "Show me." Rinei pulled up the full structural map. Fossat studied it in silence for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally zooming into specific clusters, rotating the three-dimensional model, tracing the regulatory pathways with his fingertip hovering just above the screen. Davin stood near the door, watching. When Fossat finally spoke, he did not ask questions. He said that the regulatory architecture was recursive. Each lock referenced other locks, which referenced still others, forming a chain that looped back on itself in ways that should have been biologically impossible. He said it looked like someone had written a program and then hidden it inside living tissue. Rinei told him about the zero-match result from the archive database. Fossat nodded slowly, as if he had expected it. He asked for access to the lab's protein folding simulator, the high-resolution one reserved for classified research. Rinei gave it to him without hesitation. Over the next 3 days, the three of them worked in near silence. Fossat ran predictive simulations on the dormant genes, forcing the computer to model what proteins they would produce if the regulatory locks were removed. Each simulation took hours. Each result was worse than the last. The first cluster, buried in chromosome 7, coded for a complete restructuring of neural tissue. If activated, human neurons would develop additional insulation layers and secondary signal pathways, effectively doubling processing speed while reducing signal decay. Fossat compared it to the neural architecture of the Tez-Sani, a species famous for their computational intelligence. The human version was more efficient by a factor of 3. The second cluster affected the skeletal and muscular systems. Bone density would increase to levels comparable with heavy gravity species, but without the corresponding mass penalty. Muscle fibers would shift from standard mammalian configuration to a hybrid structure that combined endurance capacity with explosive force. Rinei had studied the genetics of over 100 predator species. None of them carried this combination. The third cluster was regenerative. Cellular repair mechanisms that would normally slow with age were coded to remain at peak function indefinitely. Not immortality, but something close to it. Wound healing, tissue replacement, even limited organ regeneration, all written into sequences that were currently switched off. But it was the fourth cluster that made Fossat stop talking entirely. It sat on chromosome 12, smaller than the others, but far more densely coded. When the simulation finally completed, the display showed a neural formation that none of them recognized. It was not sensory in the traditional sense. It was not motor control or memory processing. The predicted structure appeared designed to detect and interpret electromagnetic fields at a range and resolution that no known biological organism possessed. Davin broke the silence. He asked what that meant in practical terms. Fossat told him it meant that a fully activated human could potentially sense electrical systems, magnetic fields, and possibly even the faint bioelectric signatures of other living beings. Not through technology, through their own nervous system. Rinai pulled up the full activation model, every dormant cluster combined into a single projection. The composite organism that appeared on screen was still recognizably human in shape. 2 arms, 2 legs, upright posture, bilateral symmetry. But the internal architecture was something else entirely. It was faster than any species in the Confederacy's predator registry. It was more durable than species that had evolved on worlds with twice Earth's gravity. It could heal from injuries that would kill most sapient beings. And it could sense the world around it in ways that the galaxy's best sensor technology could only approximate. Fassad sat down heavily. He said that the Confederacy's most advanced genetic engineering programs had spent centuries trying to produce enhancements like these, one at a time, in controlled laboratory conditions, with failure rates above 60%. Whoever had built this had encoded all of them into a single genome, made them self-regulating, made them inheritable, and then locked them behind triggers that ensured they would only activate under specific conditions. Rinai asked him to estimate the level of technological sophistication required to do something like this. Fassad laughed, but there was no humor in it. He said it was beyond estimation. The Confederacy could not do this today. The Confederacy could not do this in 1,000 years. Whoever had written these sequences operated at a level of biological engineering that made current galactic science look like cave paintings. Davin asked the question that had been sitting in the room since Fassad arrived. He asked who had done this, who had reached into early human DNA and placed a sleeping monster inside it. Rinai looked at Fassad. Fassad looked at the display. Neither of them had an answer, but Rinai knew where to look. The archive's oldest records stretched back tens of thousands of years, into eras before the current Confederacy existed, when other civilizations had risen and fallen across the galaxy. Somewhere in those ancient files, buried under layers of dead languages and corrupted data, there might be a trace of whoever had touched humanity before humanity even knew it existed. She told Fassad and Davin that they were going deeper. Fassad rubbed his eyes and said he had been afraid she would say that. Davin simply nodded and began clearing his schedule. The lab lights hummed softly above them. On the display, the projected image of a fully activated human rotated slowly in the dark, its eyes closed, its body still, like something dreaming just beneath the surface of the world. Fassad found the trigger mechanism on the 5th day, and when he did, he wished he had been mapping the regulatory gates that kept the dormant sequences locked, trying to understand the conditions under which they might open. Most genetic switches in most species were simple. A hormone signal, a temperature change, a dietary shift. Straightforward cause and effect. The human system was nothing like that. Each regulatory gate responded to a specific biochemical cocktail, and every single one of those cocktails was tied to stress. Not ordinary stress. Not the mild tension of a difficult task or an argument with a neighbor. The triggers required sustained, extreme, body-wide crisis signals. The kind of signals a body only produced when it was fighting to survive something that should have killed it. Cortisol at concentrations that would indicate months of unbroken danger. Adrenaline patterns consistent with repeated, life-threatening encounters over extended periods. Inflammatory markers associated with severe injury, starvation, and environmental poisoning, all at the same time. The gates were not designed to open because a human had a bad day. They were designed to open because a human's entire world was ending. Rinai studied the trigger map and felt something cold settle in her chest. She asked Fassad what would happen if all the triggers fired at once. He told her he had already tried to model that. The simulation had crashed. She asked him to try again with more processing power allocated. He did. It crashed again, but on the 3rd attempt, with the lab's entire computational reserve dedicated to the single task, the simulation completed. The 3 of them stood around the display and watched the results unfold in silence. The transformation was not instant. It was generational. The first wave of activation would enhance the current generation moderately, sharpening reflexes, increasing pain tolerance, boosting immune response. Significant, but not alarming. The second wave, passed to the next generation, would be more dramatic. The neural enhancements would begin to manifest. Bone density would increase. Healing would accelerate. By the third generation, if the pressure was sustained, the electromagnetic sensing cluster would activate. By the fourth, the full composite profile would emerge. The organism at the end of the fourth generation was the same one they had seen before, the projected image that had haunted Rinniai's thoughts for days. But now they understood the path that led to it. It was not a switch that flipped. It was a ladder that climbed, and every rung was built from suffering. David asked a question that Rinniai had been avoiding. He asked whether any of the triggers had ever fired in human history. Fassad pulled up Earth's environmental record from the Confederacy's planetary database. What filled the screen made all three of them go still. Earth's history was a catalog of disasters. Ice ages that had buried entire continents under kilometers of frozen waste for tens of thousands of years. Volcanic events that had darkened the sky for decades. Asteroid impacts that had erased most life on the surface. Plagues that had killed 30, 40, 60% of the human population in single waves. Wars so vast they had burned entire regions to ash. And through every single one of these events, the trigger thresholds had been met. Not fully, not all at once, but partially again and again and again across hundreds of thousands of years. Each catastrophe had opened a few more gates. Each extinction-level threat had pushed the dormant genome a fraction further toward activation. Fassad overlaid the trigger data on a historical timeline, and the pattern became terrifyingly clear. Humanity had been activating slowly for their entire existence as a species. Every ice age, every plague, every war had been a key turning in a lock that nobody knew was there. The process was not sudden. It was glacial, patient, built into the rhythm of a world that never stopped trying to kill the beings living on it. Rinniai asked what percentage of the dormant genome was currently active in modern humans. Fassad ran the numbers twice to be certain. He said approximately 11%, 0.11%. After 200,000 years of continuous catastrophe, after every disaster their world had thrown at them, humans had unlocked barely a tenth of what was hidden inside them. And at 11%, they had already split the atom, left their planet, built thinking machines, and reached the stars. David sat down slowly. He said that the design was elegant in a way that disturbed him. Whoever had built this system had not wanted the power to be free. They had wanted it to be earned, not through merit or intelligence, but through survival, through endurance, through the sheer biological stubbornness of refusing to die on a world that was specifically chosen to make dying easy. Rinniai understood now. Earth was not a cradle. It was a forge, and humanity was the metal that had been placed inside it, heated and hammered and cooled and heated again for 200,000 years, and the process was still not finished. She closed the simulation and turned to Fassad. She told him they needed to search the archive's oldest records. If someone had designed this system, there would be traces. Engineering on this scale did not happen without documentation, even if that documentation was ancient and buried. Fassad agreed, but his hands were not steady. David noticed and said nothing. Rinniai locked the lab behind them as they left for the archive wing. The display powered down, and the image of the fully activated human faded into darkness. But even in the dark, even switched off, the data remained stored in the system, waiting quietly, the way the dormant genes waited inside every human being who had ever drawn breath on that violent, beautiful, merciless little world. The archive's deep storage occupied an entire level of pallor, 9 that most researchers never visited. The lighting was dim, the air recycled and stale, and the data terminals were old models that required physical interface cables instead of wireless links. Rinniai had only been down here once before, during her orientation tour 30 years ago. She had never had a reason to return. The oldest records in the Confederacy's collection predated the Confederacy itself by tens of thousands of years. They had been inherited from predecessor civilizations, copied from ruins, extracted from derelict ships found drifting in empty space. Much of it was corrupted. Some of it was in languages that had never been fully translated. All of it was classified at the highest level, accessible only to senior researchers with specific clearance. Rinai had that clearance. She plugged her credentials into the terminal and began searching. She did not know exactly what she was looking for, so she started broad. She searched for any reference to genetic engineering of pre-sapient species. The system returned over 400 results, most of them fragmentary, most of them describing failed experiments by civilizations that had long since gone extinct. She narrowed the search to projects involving deliberate encoding of dormant traits. The results dropped to 19. She narrowed again, filtering for projects that targeted species on high-danger worlds. 0.3 results remained. 0.2 of them were useless. Corrupted files, barely readable, referencing species and worlds that no longer existed. But the third was different. It was a single entry, filed under no official project name, tagged only with a classification code that the terminal translated roughly as Inheritance Protocol. The entry was attributed to a civilization referred to in the archive's records as the Foundational Engineers. Rinai had heard the name before. Every geneticist in the Confederacy had. The engineers were semi-mythical, a species or collective that had supposedly existed long before any current civilization, believed to have seeded biological potential across hundreds of young worlds before vanishing completely. Most serious researchers treated them as legend. There was never enough evidence to confirm they had been real. Until now. The file was fragmented, missing large sections, and written in a symbolic language that the terminal could only partially decode. But what remained was enough. The engineers had operated on a philosophy that was radically different from any approach the modern Confederacy used. They did not uplift species. They did not intervene directly. They did not give gifts. Instead, they identified young worlds with high environmental volatility, worlds where survival was difficult and extinction was a constant threat, and they encoded potential into the native species' genomes. Raw, unfinished locked potential. Then they left. The logic, as far as Rinai could piece together from the fragments, was simple and brutal. The universe was dangerous. Any species that was given power without earning it would eventually be destroyed by it or destroy others with it. But a species that had to fight for every generation of survival, that had to endure catastrophe after catastrophe just to continue existing, would develop the resilience, the judgment, and the collective will to wield that power responsibly. The encoding was not a gift. It was a test, and the test was the species' entire history. Fassad read over her shoulder. He pointed to a section near the end of the fragment that contained a partial list. It appeared to be a classification of worlds that had been selected for the Inheritance Protocol, ranked by environmental danger level. Most of the entries were unreadable, corrupted beyond recovery. But the ranking system was intact, running from Tier 1, the mildest, to Tier 9, the most extreme. Rinai searched the list for anything matching Earth's coordinates or description. She found it near the bottom of the fragment, partially corrupted but still legible. Earth was classified as Tier 8. Fassad exhaled sharply. Davin asked what the highest populated tier in the current galaxy was. Rinai checked the archive. The answer was Tier 4, a heavy gravity world in the outer arm whose native species had developed natural armor plating and was considered one of the most physically durable beings in the Confederacy. Humans came from a world rated twice as dangerous, and their encoded potential reflected it. Davin asked if there were any Tier 9 worlds. Rinai searched. The records showed 2, both listed as extinction confirmed. Whatever species had been seeded on those worlds had not survived long enough to unlock anything. The worlds had killed them. Earth had nearly done the same to humanity dozens of times. But humans had refused to die. Rinai saved everything she could from the fragment and copied it to a secure drive. Fassad asked her what she intended to do with the information. She said she did not know yet. Part of her wanted to bury it, to lock the file away and pretend she had never found it. Part of her knew that was impossible. The data she had already submitted to the standard sequencing system had triggered automatic flags. Someone on the Science Council would have already noticed AS if to confirm her fear, her communicator chimed. A message from the Council's administrative office. She was being summoned to present her findings before the full assembly in 3 days. Fassad read the message and said nothing. His face had the look of someone watching a door open that could never be closed again. Rinai powered down the terminal and stood. The deep storage level was silent around them, rows and rows of ancient data stretching into the dim distance. The accumulated knowledge of civilizations that had risen, flourished, and fallen to dust while humanity was still learning to walk upright on their savage little world, completely unaware that the fire inside them had been placed there on purpose, by beings who had looked at Earth and decided that if any species could survive it, that species deserved everything. The council chamber on Palor 9 was built to hold representatives from over 60 species, arranged in a tiered semicircle that rose steeply from the central speaking floor. When Rinai walked in, carrying her datapad and nothing else, she counted delegates from at least 42 member worlds. Word had spread. The chamber was nearly full, and the air carried the particular tension that came when powerful beings sensed that something was about to change. She was given the floor without ceremony. A brief introduction from the presiding administrator, a Tezsani, whose name Rinai forgot the moment she heard it, and then silence. 42 species watching. Waiting, Rinai began with the facts. She presented the sequencing results, the dormant genome map, the zero-match comparison against the archive's full database. She showed the protein folding simulations, the predicted enhancements, the composite projection of a fully activated human. She presented the trigger mechanism, the connection to extreme survival stress, the evidence of slow partial activation across 200,000 years of human history. She presented the foundational engineer's fragment, the inheritance protocol, the tier classification system, and Earth's rating. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not editorialize. She did not speculate. She let the data speak for itself. When she finished, the chamber was silent for nearly 10 seconds. Then it erupted. The first to speak was a military attaché from the Drenai Collective, a species that had built its entire civilization around strategic dominance. He stood, his armored carapace clicking as he shifted, and said that the implications were obvious. Humanity carried a latent biological weapon encoded into their very cells. If fully activated, they would become the most dangerous sapient species in the Confederacy by a significant margin. He recommended immediate containment, genetic monitoring of all humans within Confederacy space, and a formal threat assessment conducted under military oversight. Several delegates murmured agreement. The Drenai had allies, species that valued security above all else and saw threats in anything they could not control. But the Marini delegate rose next. She was older than Fassad, white-haired and calm, and she spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had survived enough political storms to know when fear was driving the room instead of reason. She pointed out that the dormant genome had existed inside humans for at least 200,000 years. It had not activated catastrophically. It had not produced a monster. It had produced a species that built art and music and medicine, that crossed oceans in wooden boats, and then crossed the void between stars and metal ones. Containment of a species for carrying potential they had never misused was not policy. It was panic. The debate fractured along predictable lines. Military species wanted action. Academic species wanted study. Diplomatic species wanted caution. The noise rose and fell in waves as delegates argued across the tiered chamber, some standing, some shouting in languages that the translation system struggled to keep up with. That IT was the Hesori delegate who silenced the room, that he was old, even by Hesori standards, and he had served on the council longer than most delegates had been alive. He did not stand. He simply spoke from his seat in a voice that carried without effort, and the chamber went quiet because when a Hesori strategist spoke, even the Drenai listened. He said he wanted to talk about numbers. He pulled up a display showing humanity's achievement timeline, sourced from their own historical records submitted during first contact. Anatomically modern humans had existed for roughly 300,000 years. For most of that time, they had been tribal, pre-agricultural, surviving on a world that was actively trying to kill them. Then, in the last 10,000 years, an eye blink in evolutionary terms, they had invented agriculture, writing, mathematics, engineering, medicine, nuclear physics, computing, and spaceflight. They had gone from stone tools to artificial intelligence in less time than it took most Confederacy species to develop a second language. He reminded the chamber of Ren'Ai's finding. Modern humans were operating at approximately 11% activation of their dormant potential. He let that number sit in the air for a moment. Then he asked the room a question. He said that if humans had accomplished all of this, everything from fire to fusion to faster-than-light travel, 11%, what did the council believe would happen at 20%? At 50? At 100? No one answered. He asked a second question. He said that if the council voted for containment, for quarantine, for any hostile action against humanity, what did the council believe that would do to a species whose dormant genome was specifically designed to activate in response to existential threat? The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was the silence of people who had just realized they were standing at the edge of something they could not take back. The Drenai attaché sat down slowly. He did not speak again. Ren'Ai watched from the speaking floor. She had presented the science. The politics were not her field, but she understood what the Hasori had just done. He had not argued for compassion or fairness or ethics. He had argued from pure strategic logic, and his argument was simple. Humanity was not a threat that could be contained. Attempting to contain them might be the one thing that turned them into one. The presiding administrator called for a preliminary vote on the question of immediate action. The chamber voted. The result was narrow, closer than Ren'Ai had hoped, but it held no intervention. No containment. No threat assessment. Observation only. Careful, quiet, from a distance. Ren'Ai gathered her datapad and left the chamber. Behind her, 42 species sat in uneasy silence, each of them recalculating everything they had ever assumed about the quiet, smiling, harmless species from the little blue world at the edge of the spiral arm. Ren'Ai did not return to her quarters after the council session. She went back to the lab instead, the way she always did when the world felt too large and too uncertain, because the lab was where things made sense. Data did not argue. Sequences did not have agendas. The truth sat in the numbers and waited to be read. Fassad and Davin were already there. Fassad was sitting at his terminal, staring at nothing. Davin was organizing files with the mechanical focus of someone keeping their hands busy so their mind would stop racing. Neither of them asked how the vote had gone. They already knew. News traveled fast on a station this size. Ren'Ai sat down at her own terminal and opened the human genome map one last time. The dormant sequences glowed on the display, layered and intricate, a cathedral of encoded potential built by hands that had vanished from the galaxy before most current species had learned to use fire. She was tired of looking at what humans could become. She wanted to understand what they already were. She opened a different file, one she had downloaded from the Confederacy's cultural database weeks ago when the human sample first arrived. It was a general survey of human history, compiled from records the human embassy had submitted voluntarily during the first contact documentation process. Ren'Ai had skimmed it then. Now she read it carefully. The Ice Ages came first. Periods lasting tens of thousands of years when glaciers had covered most of Earth's surface and temperatures had dropped so far that survival itself became a daily act of defiance. Humans had endured them. They had wrapped themselves in animal skins, huddled around fires, and refused to die. When the ice retreated, they spread across every continent on their world, adapting to deserts, jungles, mountains, and frozen coasts with equal stubbornness. Then came the plagues, diseases that had swept across human populations with devastating efficiency, killing millions in waves that repeated across centuries. The great pestilence of their medieval period had killed nearly half the population of an entire continent. They had buried their dead, mourned, and rebuilt. It happened again and again. Each time, they rebuilt. The wars were the hardest to read. Humans had fought each other with a ferocity that was difficult for Ren'Ai to comprehend. They had burned cities, poisoned land, developed weapons capable of destroying their entire world. And yet, somehow, in the spaces between the violence, they had also created things of staggering beauty. Music so complex it took years to learn to perform. Architecture that served no survival purpose, but existed purely because someone had imagined it and then made it real. Literature that explored the inner landscape of consciousness with a precision that rivaled scientific instruments. Rinei paused on a section about human medicine, a species with no natural regeneration, no venom immunity, no redundant organ systems, had taught itself to transplant hearts from one body to another. They had mapped their own genome, identified diseases at the molecular level, and built vaccines that saved millions of lives. They had done all of this with biology that was, by galactic standards, fragile and short-lived. T11%. Fassad spoke from across the lab. He said he had been running one more simulation, not of the dormant genome, but of the active one, the 11% that was already switched on. He said that even the active portion contained enhancements that most species did not possess. Elevated pattern recognition, unusually high neural plasticity, meaning the human brain could physically restructure itself in response to new challenges throughout its entire lifespan. An emotional processing system so complex it allowed humans to feel contradictory things simultaneously, to grieve and hope at the same time, to be afraid and still move forward. He said that last part was the one that disturbed him most. Not the strength or the speed or the healing. The fact that humans could be terrified and still choose to act. Most species either fought or fled. Humans could be fully aware that they were going to die and still stand their ground. Not because they lacked fear, but because they had decided something mattered more than their fear. That was not in the dormant genome. That was in the active 11%. That was what humans already were, right now, today, without any secret activation or engineered awakening. Davin asked Rinei if she was afraid of them. It was the same question he had asked days ago, when the first simulation had completed and the projected image of a fully activated human had appeared on the screen. Rinei thought about it for a long time. She thought about the council chamber and the fear she had seen in the eyes of 42 species. She thought about the Drenai attaché demanding containment. She thought about the Hasori strategist and his quiet, devastating arithmetic. She thought about the human ambassador with his easy smile, representing a species that had walked through fire for 200,000 years and come out the other side still reaching for the stars, still writing songs, still holding their children close at night. She told Davin she was not afraid of what humans might become. She was in awe of what they already were. Fassad powered down his terminal. Davin filed the last of the research documents. Rinei turned off the display, and the lab went dark. Far away, on a small blue world orbiting an ordinary yellow star, 7 billion human beings went about their ordinary lives. They woke, they worked, they argued and laughed, and loved and grieved. They carried their children to school and worried about small things and dreamed about the future. None of them knew about the ancient fire coded into their cells, the inheritance placed there before their species had a name, by beings who had looked at their savage, beautiful, impossible world and decided that anything tough enough to survive had deserved a chance at something greater. The fire burned low and steady, the way it always had. Not waiting for permission, just waiting for need.